It was a quiet Sunday morning in December. My grandmother was working at a local store. She was a cashier. All of a sudden, she heard planes flying by so low. And she heard bombs and explosions. And she ran outside, and there were just plumes of smoke. And she couldn't believe her eyes because it wasn't just one. I mean, the planes kept coming. One plane was flying so low and so close that she could actually see the pilot. And that's when she realized, looking into the pilot's eyes, he was Japanese. My grandmother thought, what does this mean for us? What does this mean for Japanese Americans living in America?
Lieutenant Janelle Kuroda, United States Navy.
As Japanese Americans, we have the same face as the enemy has. So how do you distinguish yourself, and how do you prove that you're American?
You couldn't change your face or your eyes. Amid fears that Japan would bring the war to the West Coast, 120,000 people were forcibly ordered to leave their homes and businesses and wait out the war in internment camps.
No criminal charges, no court trials, nothing. Just a unilateral action.
Norman Mineta went on to become a cabinet member and a friend of presidents.
Can you imagine going off to camp and men are with their suits and ties and women with their hats and good clothing?
They went with only what they could carry and with all the dignity they had.
In the Japanese culture, we were always told, obey authority, don't bring dishonor on the family. And it's very fatalistic, but suck it up. Bear with it.
The Japanese have a saying, shikata ga nai, that it can't be helped. What happens, happens, and you accept this and try to make the most of it.
Susumu Ito served with distinction, wearing the uniform of the U.S. Army, while his family was behind barbed wire.
They made little gardens in the front. They were decorated. They made things out of packing crates and loose lumber. And they did most of their shopping through Sears Roebuck or Montgomery Ward catalogs. And they had community activities. And there was all the time in the world to gossip and talk. Again, shikata ga nai, which means this is an order, and this is where we live, and we'll make the most of it.
We don't like what's happening to us. We have no voice, we have no leverage, but in the long run, we're going to prove our loyalty to this country.
In 1943, President Roosevelt called for the creation of an all-Japanese American combat unit, and they stepped forward.
In Hawaii, the quota was 2,500, and yet, when the call came for volunteers, 10,000 volunteered.
Terry Shima joined the 442nd Regimental Combat Team.
Our motto was go for broke, and I think that's what we did. Risk everything. Tell the Americans, look fellas, we are just as American as you are. Please accept us.
But first, they had to accept each other. Boys from Hawaii and boys from the mainland were thrown together in basic training. They were like oil and water.
Kanakas, the ones from Hawaii. You know what they call us mainlanders? Patonks. The way they tell it, if you rap on our heads, it's like hitting a coconut. Hollow heads, you know. Katonk, katonk, katonk.
The boys from Hawaii came from a place where there were no internment camps. The authorities would have had to incarcerate every third person on the islands.
Watch that stuff, huh? Get your money down, suckers. It all rides. Go for broke.
Daniel Inoue was an 18-year-old from Hawaii when he met his first mainlanders.
Keep in mind, whenever we ask those guys, where you're from, oh, I'm from Los Angeles. What does your father do? Such and such. No one ever mentioned a camp, so help me.
A kid from Honolulu and a kid from Los Angeles could smile for the photographers, but in the barracks, they spoke a different language.
These college guys are sharp, you know that? 4 years at USC and he's a bona fide recognized fruit peddler.
It got so bad that senior officers of the regiment seriously considered disbanding. How can they go into combat with a divided force? They tried everything, discussion groups and social hours and God knows what else. Nothing seemed to work.
The company commanders tried one last thing. How would the Hawaiian boys like to meet some nice Japanese girls? They were gorgeous, and they lived just down the road.
And most of the guys took their ukuleles along, guitars, to serenade the women. You know, looking forward to this great time.
They were driven across the state line to an internment camp, where inside the barbed wire, they saw faces like their own.
We tried our best to appear that we were enjoying it, but I can tell you, no such thing.
That was the turning point. From then on, the unit came together as one.
This generation believed in the goodness of America and what America can be.
We were fighting for the ideals, the teachings of democracy. All men are created equal.
Yes. I was scared shitless. You just live in this little shell right around you, and you face the enemy, and they're trying to do precisely what you're trying to do to them. But I don't know of anyone in my unit who went absent without leave.
The only case of AWOL was AWOL in reverse. That is, those in the hospitals would leave the hospital without authorization in the dead of night to return to their unit. I hope I don't sound corny, but it might be something in the national heritage, the way of life, the samurai.
The 442nd fought first in Italy, then in France. In October 1944, they were given the order to rescue a battalion from Texas, cut off by the enemy in the forests along the German frontier.
Some of us took the attitude, this is the chance we've been waiting for.
The Texans were to go down in history as the Lost Battalion.
Hitler had personally ordered to take no prisoners, to kill them all.
2 American units had already tried and failed to rescue the battalion. In came the 442nd to do what others could not.
Bitter cold, snow, rain, and the burst from the artillery barrage brought trees down on you.
To save 200 of their fellow Americans, those young men with the Japanese names took more than 600 casualties.
We were willing to do that.
Even as the 442nd was fighting on foreign soil, others were fighting for freedom inside the United States. Gordon Hirabayashi was a college student in Seattle when the war broke out. Shikata ga nai was not in his vocabulary. He refused to go to a camp, and he refused to wear the uniform of a country that questioned his loyalty on the basis of his race.
Okay, you're going to go to court for defying the draft. You're probably going to be found guilty. You're going to go to a penitentiary. You're going to pay a fine, and you're going to be ruined because everyone in the community is going to point to you and say you weren't willing to stand up, join the army, and fight for your country.
Lane Ryo Hirabayashi, Gordon's nephew, teaches history at UCLA.
Would I have the guts under those kinds of conditions back then to say no? I'd like to think that I would, but I can't say for certain because that's a lot of pain. Gordon's mom begged him not to do it. She didn't want the family split up because for that generation of Japanese Americans, the family was the key thing. And she said, let us stay together. This is going to be a time of crisis. It's going to be a war here. We don't know what's going to happen to you if you do this. We may never see. Sorry. And he said she was crying. And he said it was the hardest thing. He said it was harder than the FBI agents, harder than the marshals, harder than the warden, was telling Mom, I gotta do this. You gotta understand. You may be right, but I have to do this.
Gordon Hirabayashi served more than 2 years in jail, only to lose his case in the Supreme Court. In his footsteps came another American, Fred Korematsu from Oakland, California. He too refused to bow to authority and became a stranger in his own community.
Fred had brothers dead set against this. Many people counseled him to not do this, Fred. Don't rock the boat. Don't go ahead with this. You're just going to lose and it's going to cause more problems for us. His only hope then is to win his case. But the Supreme Court rules against him. 40 years later, he rose up to fight again.
In the 1980s, new evidence came to light. Documents buried in government archives since World War II. Among them, a report by U.S. military intelligence in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. The entire Japanese problem has been magnified out of its true proportion and should be handled on the basis of the individual and not on a racial basis. The government lawyers who prosecuted Hirabayashi and Korematsu had the report in their hands, but they never showed it to the Supreme Court justices. Dale Minami led the legal team that challenged the wartime decisions.
When I first saw this information that the Supreme Court was lied to, that there was evidence that was suppressed in front of the Supreme Court, we saw the opportunity that we could actually, in a sense, rewrite history by telling the truth.
In 1983, a federal court overturned Korematsu's conviction. Fred Korematsu went on to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom.
I've always felt that physical courage is a bit easier than moral courage. Thank God Korematsu was around.
A federal court of appeals also overturned the conviction of Gordon Hirabayashi, finding him innocent of any crime.
That's one thing about democracy, you must be patient.
A few months after his death, Gordon Hirabayashi received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. The last of the Go for Broke guys came to Washington in 2011. Every man was given the Congressional Gold Medal. The 442nd remains, for its size, the most decorated unit in the history of the American military.
I like to think that I would have jumped at the chance as my grandfather did, to defend the country. And to answer honestly, I have no idea. but I got a tattoo that reminds me of the 442nd.
My great uncle was killed in action in Monte Cassino, Italy.
I think that this legacy is a very telling story. This is an American story.
In times of war, civil rights will suffer. I think unless people remember the lessons of what happened to Japanese Americans, the lessons of the mistakes that were made, we're walking down that same road that led to one of the greatest civil rights disasters this country has seen. Justice is not a given, it's not a gift, it's a challenge.